It's coming up. Anyways, so I'm going to talk about beer. Who here likes beer? All right. So, beer, yay! So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. So, anthropologists kind of assume beer kind of came around in ancient Mesopotamia. They have clay tablets dating back to about 9,000 BC that discuss beer. It wasn't exactly the same beer that we brew now, but they kind of assumed that they had a kind of a clay pot, and they were storing some grain in there, and they had all this grain in there, and then they left to go hunt. And while they were hunting, it rained. And then it rained just a little bit, and it got hot. And that, therefore, caused that grain in that container to sprout. That's what they call malting. And then it filled up some more with water. And what was left was malted grain in water, and there's natural yeasts in the air. Came out of it was beer, in a sense. And they were like, came back from their hunt, and somebody was brave enough to give it a little taste, and they're like, I like this. So as I say, anthropologists believe that beer is actually what turned us from hunter-gatherers into an agricultural society, not necessarily bread, because the oldest clay tablets are talking about beer, not bread. Bread didn't come about for another 1,500 years or so. So beer is, like it says here, until 822 AD, hops were not used. It was always using other herbs and things to kind of bitter it. The United States was built on beer. Many of the founding fathers were actually brewers themselves. Washington, Jefferson, Sam Adams, as is the brewery back in Massachusetts named after him. And the Pilgrims actually landed at Plymouth Rock because they ran out of the beer that was on their ship. So they ran it, they're like, we're out. They landed at Plymouth Rock. So, and the reason for that was because they would brew beer. It was really low alcohol content, but it would keep all the bacteria from growing in their drinks. So they would brew it, but it would be really low, and that's just what they would drink. So beer, what is beer? Beer is an alcoholic beverage made by brewing and fermentation from grain, usually malted barley, flavored with hops, and similar things for a slightly bitter taste. In Germany, they have what's called I don't know how you say this, Reinheitsgebot, I don't know, but that basically means that it's a 500-year-old law in Germany that says beer is only yeast, hops, and barley, nothing else. And it's a law in Germany that you cannot put the word beer on anything that has anything other than those three ingredients. Today, in most beers, you'll have, especially like the Bud Miller Coors, they'll have rice, they'll have corn, you'll have other grains, Hefeweizen with wheat. There's also Berliner Weiss, things like that. They all have some wheat in them that you can brew with. Oatmeal stouts have oats in them, and then rye gives it a kind of spicy flavor. So there are two types of beer. We have lagers and ales. Lagers are brewed, fermented at cold temperatures. So they have a very crisp, light flavor. These are your typical Pilsners, but they can be any color. So that doesn't necessarily mean, but your Budweiser, your Miller Lights, those are lagers, they're Pilsners, they're brewed cold, conditioned cold, and the difference is the yeast used. So lagers are use bottom fermentation. So they put in the yeast first, they pour in the liquid, and then it's kept cold, and that's how it ferments. Ales, you put in the liquid, you throw the yeast on top, and that's called top fermentation. And those are typically fermented anywhere from about 60 degrees to even close to 95 degrees for some, depending on the flavors you're wanting to get. Lagers are typically between 35 and 50 degrees. So here's some frequently asked questions. Is homebrewing legal? In the state of Utah, it was legalized in 2009. John Huntsman legalized it. Before that, Jimmy Carter in 1976 signed a bill that made it legal, made it a thing that states could then legalize. Is homebrewing safe? It is very safe. because even the smallest amount of alcohol in your liquid will kill anything that's really bad in there. It might not taste very good if you get some contaminations of things, but it's not going to kill you. How much space do I need? This depends a lot on the size of the brews you're going to be doing. There are people that can brew 1 gallon batches, which is typically kind of what I do, just because I like to experiment and do different things. I typically only do 1 to 2, maybe I've done a handful, 5, 6, 7 gallons, but typically I end up like keeping bottles for like a year because I don't end up drinking that many. So you don't need a lot of space, maybe somewhere to store some of the newer equipment you need and somewhere to store your beer. 1 gallon will get you about 10 to 12 bottles. So, will you need to buy a lot of new equipment? Yes and no, depending on the size and things like that. Will homebrewing save you money? Probably not. But if you're used to going to the liquor store here and buying, $2, $3 bottles, it will save you money because it's around $1.50 per bottle. And will homebrewing stink up my house? On brew day, it will smell a lot like hops and malted barley. But if you like that smell, it's not a bad thing. But other than that, it will not. So here's kind of some of the equipment. So a big stock pot. This is the one I use for my 1 gallon brews. I forgot my long-handled spoon. I use this electric kitchen scale, grams, ounces, things like that. Let me grab this other stuff over here. An instant read thermometer. What else we got here? A timer. I just use my phone. A strainer, or a brew bag. If you're doing bigger ones, you use a brew bag. A plastic bucket and a lid with a hole in it. And you put this is called an airlock, which is the next one. Put that on top. A jug or a carboy. This is a jug that I use, that I got from a gallon of apple juice from the grocery store. And I just keep reusing it. That I actually use to make hard cider. An auto siphon, which looks like this. And this is used to take the liquid out of here, put it into here for secondary fermentation, and out of that into the bottling when you're done. It's a tube, it's a bottle filler, bottle capper. So there's kind of a rundown of prices and things for some of this equipment. I bought a kit when I first started. It was about $45. It had a jug, but the rest of it I kind of picked up here and there, so it wasn't like I was buying it all at one time. But that's kind of a rundown of some of the equipment. And if you guys have any questions, please interrupt me because there's not that many people here. So,
David?
Yes?
What do you use for your sanitizer?
Okay, yes. Did I not bring it? I did not bring it. It's a little container. It's instant sanitizer. You mix it with water, and all it has to do is it's food safe. It's not bleach or anything. It doesn't have any flavors. You just get some water, put the sanitizer in it, and sanitize it.
What is that called?
Star San. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at brewing stores, things like that. So.
Do you use a device to measure the alcohol content? I got a coworker who would always talk about something with that.
This is called a hydrometer.
Oh yeah.
So you put the liquid in here, and this weighs out. And when you put it in, it'll even out. If it's plain water, it'll even out at 0. This will actually measure the amount of dissolved sugars in the liquid. So when you drop it in, if it comes up like this, that's going to be 35% alcohol. If it does ferment all the way out. So, but that's a hydrometer. So there are 3 typical ways of brewing beer. You have extract, which uses either a powdered malt extract, dry malt extract, or a liquid malt extract. It looks kind of like honey or molasses. You have partial extract, which uses some of this and then some of this, or all grain, which is the one that I like the best because you can experiment a lot more and you get a lot more flavor. Extract, basically somebody else does all the hard work for you. You dissolve either the powder or the syrup in water, and that's not as interesting. But you will, if you're brewing other than like a pale ale or a lager, you will need to use specialty grains, which I'll touch on here in a second. So, malts, is typically what they're called, is the grain used in your brew. They range from a light to a very dark. Barley, wheat, rye, those are your typical malts. You also have adjunct corn, rice hulls, oatmeal, things like that. Your base malts are going to be very light to an amber color. That's how you get a lot of your beer flavors. And then your specialty malts are going to be chocolate, caramel, black, coffee flavored. And you use very small amounts because they go a long way. And so if you're doing like an extract, like I said on the page before, you dissolve your extract, and then if you're like wanting a stout, you have a small bag of some dark malted grains that are milled, and you just steep that for 10 or 15 minutes before you get it going. So, hops. Hops are a flower. Yes?
A question about a while ago. I just don't want to get this. So did you say that when there was alcohol in something, it wasn't just alcohol, is it, that kills the bacteria? It's a probiotic, right?
So, yes and no.
Okay.
There's different kinds of beers that some will have probiotics in them, but for the most part, it's just going to be alcohol.
So the fermentation doesn't create a probiotic necessarily. That's lactic acid.
So you can have lactic acid fermentation. Sour beers use a lactic acid fermentation, but those are not very common.
Okay.
And what happens, well, with lactobacillus bacteria are very small compared to the yeasts. So most people that are brewing, if they're brewing sour beers, will have complete separate materials. Because it's a lot harder to sanitize after lactobacillus, just because you have to make sure everything is completely sanitized. Yes. So.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Yep. Okay. So hops. Hops are the other third main ingredient of beer. You have here, this is a dried flower hop, petals here, this is pellet hops. Most recipes use pellet hops. Their flavors can range from woody, grassy to pineapple and mango, depending on what you want to get out of your beer. If you try a lot of different beers, you'll know most IPAs, if you like IPAs, use New World hops. They taste like citrus, lemon, grapefruit, that type of flavor. Or pine, those also have kind of a New World hops will have a pine flavor. There's a whole new range of hops coming out and from New Zealand, Australia, South America that have a lot of tropical flavors. It's kind of a little strange that these coming from tropical places have more tropical flavors, but it's just kind of how it works. Old World hops, herbal, floral. If you've ever had like a Czech Pilsner, it's kind of herbal and spicy rather than an American Pilsner, which is more citrus. So. The yeast, that's what works to make it beer. Otherwise, you just have really sugary barley tea. So the yeast, you actually have very different yeasts depending on the type of beer you're brewing, because they've been bred now for hundreds of years, depending on what type of beer. I know, I forgot the name of it, it's a German beer. They've had the same strain of yeast going back for 600 years. And they just keep a small amount and make sure that that's the yeast that they're using every time. So let's talk about the steps that it takes to brew beer. So, mash. This is where you take your pot here, and if you're doing all grain, which is what I'm kind of talk about because that's the one I like to do. So if you're doing an all grain, you take this mash, you take your water and you heat it up to about 160 degrees. Once it reaches 160 degrees, which is why I have this nice thermometer that beeps at me when it hits 160 degrees, then you add the grain. You stir in the grain, and then you want to keep that between 148 and 153 degrees. Typically, that can range depending, you can get really beefy and do all sorts of fun stuff with that. Changes the mouthfeel, things like that. But you want to keep that for 1 hour at 148 to 153 degrees. There's some range there, but that's where the ideal temperature. And then once you've done that for an hour, you heat it up to 170, which is called mash out. And then you have really sugary liquid. And then, next thing you do, it's called sparging. And you take the grain and the water, you run it through a mesh strainer like this, and you dump it in, and then what you actually have is you have sparge water. You have a separate thing of water, but then you dump over the top of it. That rinses all the sugar off of your grain. And so then what you're left with is like concentrated sugary liquid. That's actually called wort. Right here, wort. That's what brewers call pre-beer, beer before beer. So then you have a hop boil. So after you've done all that, you put it back in this pot, you heat it on high until it starts to boil. Once it starts to boil, that's called the hop break. Then you add your bittering hops. This depends on the recipe, how much, things like that. But you add your bittering hops. And then you, depending on your recipe, depending on your type, yes?
Sorry, what do you mean by heat break?
So that's once the boiling liquid, once it starts to boil. So it'll build up this kind of a sugary foam on top, and it's once that starts to, the rolling boil. That's the heat break. That's when you add hops. You add hops for aroma, depending on the recipe, and then Irish moss, which is, if you look at anything, carrageenan is what it is. But you add it to your beer, it makes all the proteins collect and makes your beer very clear. So you add that about 15 minutes before you make it boil.
Is that what it's for, just to make it clear?
Yep.
Nothing else? So is that strained out?
Yeah, so everything gets strained out.
Some people are apparently sensitive to it.
Yeah, it gets strained out, so there might be somewhat, but it shouldn't be any, because everything gets strained out. So. Then you have a wort cool. You gotta cool this as fast as possible, because this is when everything that comes in contact with your wort should be completely sanitized. Because this is super sugary liquid that will grow any bacteria, things like that. So you want to cool this as fast as possible. If you're doing 5-gallon brews, so pretty much all the steps up to this point have been pretty much the same, either 1 or 5 gallons. That's typically the recipe sizes, 1 or 5 gallons. But you want to cool it as fast as possible. I filled my sink yesterday when I was brewing a Hefeweizen. I filled my sink with snow, and then put the pot in there, and then it cooled it down. So there's a wort chiller, which is what people use for 5-gallon brews, and it's just coiled copper tubing that they run cold water through, and the cold water will come out, and then warm water will come out. So. And then, so once that's done, you add your wort to your bucket like this, and everything is sanitized beforehand. And you pitch the yeast. So this means you put the yeast in there, depending on the recipe and size like that, and then you aerate it. So I will take a whisk, I'll sanitize the whisk, and then I'll just whisk it up. And then I put the lid on the bucket, and then it just sits in the corner for 2 weeks. And you put the airlock in like this. Fill that up with a little bit of water. So that keeps any bacteria and things from getting in. And then as it ferments, carbon dioxide is released, and it pushes out all the excess oxygen, and you'll start to see bubbles on the top of this. So
You take the little cap off.
this,
The little cap on top, and you take the cap off while, so that.
there's holes in the top of this.
Oh.
Yeah. So fermentation, primary fermentation is about 2 weeks. Depending on your recipe, there's always differences there. 2 weeks, and that should eat up all the sugar within there. And then what most people do is they then add it to the secondary fermentation. So then I will siphon it from the bucket into this, and then add another stopper, an airlock on top. And that gives you secondary fermentation, yes.
For the secondary ferment, do you add anything?
Depends on the recipe. Like if I'm doing a dry hopped IPA, I'll add hops here. I've done a chocolate coconut stout, where on this I added toasted coconut and cocoa nibs. So things like that I'm doing. Like I said, I brewed a Hefeweizen yesterday, and when I go to secondary, I'm going to add blueberries in one and grapefruit peels in the other. So once that's done, you wait anywhere from another 2 weeks to 4 weeks to 3 months. It doesn't really matter on the fermentation, secondary fermentation. What you want to do is you just want to get all of the proteins and yeasts out of the beer. So you want this to be clean and yes.
So during the fermentation process, either first or secondary, is there an idea of the temperature, just room temperature? Or?
Depends on the type, really, the type of beer you're brewing. So like I said, it can range anywhere from 65 to 95 degrees. Typically, I try to keep mine in between 65 and 70 degrees, so it's about room temperature. But in the summertime, I like to brew a Saison. Those like really hot temperatures. So Belgian ales, you want to keep those a little bit warmer. So those you want to do 75, 80 degrees. Saison 95 degrees is probably the very highest limit you want to go with that, but it gives it a lot of fruity flavors, clove, peppercorn kind of flavors from the yeasts. So.
Questions. How long does it take you from gathering your ingredients till it goes into the pot? I mean, the white pepper, typically now that you're.
So a typical brew day, from mash to completed in the bucket, is about 2.5 to 3 hours. But a lot of it's unattended, like I'm doing other things, so set timers and things. So it's a lot of beer brewing is sanitizing and waiting. It's like it's fun and yeah. Yes.
The other question is, what is, if you're not adding additional flavors, what is the other purpose, or is there another purpose with secondary fermentation?
Okay, so when you're in here, when you're done, you've added all of this, the yeast will eat up a lot of your sugars, and they'll leave a lot of stuff on the bottom called shrub. You want to get your beer off of that, because that will leave it some flavors if it sits on it for too long. So then you add it to this clean container that's got nothing in it, and the yeast will eat any extra stuff that's left in here. It's just kind of finishing it up. So like depending on the beer, if you're doing like a barley wine or something that's higher alcohol, you'll want this to stay in secondary for a month, 2 months, 6 months, depending on what you're trying to go for. So it comes from a lot of trial and error. So, once that's done, you bottle it. And I brought some bottles and a bottle filler to show. This is a bottle filler. And you use this auto siphon and the tube. Stick this in here. Or put the liquid in here. And then this tube. This all has to be sanitized, so there's a lot of steps before this, but put that on here. Put this end on here. The way this auto siphon works is you just kind of bring it up and push it down, and then the liquid should start flowing. And then you push down on this, and this has a little valve on the bottom, spring-loaded valve. When you push down, that's when the liquid starts to come out. And you let it come up to the very tip top, and then you take it out, and go to the next one. And then once that's done, you take your capper, like this. Brought a couple of caps to show how that works. Put the cap that has been sanitized on top, and then you just like that. There's capped. And that will take, once you've capped your beer, 2 more weeks, and it'll be carbonated.
You leave it out, right?
Yeah.
You leave it out.
I leave it in room temperature. Again, the yeast need to consume extra sugar. So it's priming sugar, I have priming sugar. And the yeast will eat the sugar that's left, and it will carbonate it. So we'll take it from flat to carbonated in about 2 weeks. So, and that's it. Yay.
Hey, David, I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have to buy, like, can you just use tops from other beer bottles?
No. You'll have to buy new caps every time, but they're cheap. I think I bought 300 of them for $10, so it's not expensive for the bottle caps. The bottles, you can reuse bottles. So I have never purchased bottles because either I get them from family, friends, or drink it myself. So I just reuse the bottles, reuse so everything's kind of there and does it. So, any other questions?
Have you ever made any kind of cider?
Yes.
What's the difference in that process?
Cider is significantly easier and less time consuming. So, I said that I bought this jug. This was organic apple juice. I got it from Harmon's, I think. And to make this cider, I opened it up, cut open the yeast, put yeast in it. I went like this. Sat it in the corner.
Yes!
That's it. If you want sparkling cider, then you have to add priming sugar and bottle it just like you would beer. But if you want a still cider, you could take it from there, add it to a flip top cap bottle. You can put it in one of these bottles and cap it. Like there's nothing else you have to do. Just make sure that when you are bottling it, you sanitize it. You could leave it in this if you wanted to, and just pour it out.
Could you do secondary fermentation in the original one? Or do you have to do it in the,
So you don't have to do a secondary fermentation with ciders.
well, you said to make it sparkling.
Oh, for a secondary, so that is different, that's bottle finish. So you have to then put it in here.
So you have to pour it into a separate.
To make it sparkling, it has to be sealed. So technically you could probably, but I wouldn't risk it because it comes below.
Yeah.
So,
With kombucha, they call that bottle conditioning second ferment. So that's why I'm used to that terminology.
Well, I do that with, I used to do kombucha, I do water from beer now, and I just burp the bottles daily, and I have had it blow up twice, and I was never there when it happened. Once it was inside the refrigerator. I don't know if it's technically whatever, but ordinarily it's not a problem, just watching it.
yeah.
So I was wondering,
You probably could if you were keeping an eye on it, but
We did that where when you're done with the first fermentation, you just put the lid back on and keep it kind of loose and put it in the fridge.
I mean,
And then it'll keep fermenting, but it'll
What
turn
about
carbonate because you've sealed
yeah,
it.
that's gonna slow it down a lot, the cold temperature will.
Yeah.
So,
And so your first, you just left it inside your house, huh?
yeah.
That's what we did too.
So yeah, with cider, it's really easy. Like cider, wine, it's like take juice, put it in a sanitized container, add yeast, airlock. Like, there's not all these other steps. I almost feel like it's cheating a little bit. But I actually like beer a lot more than ciders and wines. The best cider I've ever had, though, used a Saison yeast that gives it this kind of fruity, peppery flavor. And that actually is the best cider I ever had. Saison.
Do you get most of your equipment like on Amazon or certain places locally where one could?
Okay, so I was going to talk about this next. So there's this website, thekitchen.com. It's the same person who wrote this book. And she actually, step by step, shows you where to get equipment, where to get recipes, things like that. And it's like very simple. She goes through and breaks down every step, like all of the pieces, all of the parts. Like I walked through her thing and I was like, man, I wish I would have done that one the first time I drew here.
And she tells you why you're doing it, right?
Yeah. She talks about like this is why you're doing this and this, and then she even has a whole section on like if you get done and you taste your beer, like that tastes weird. She goes through and tells you what you did wrong to cause those things to taste that way.
nice.
So
So there are no brick and mortar brewing supply stores in
There is,
Utah County?
not in Utah County.
There's Solid.
In Midvale, there's Salt City Brew Supply, which is on Fort Union Boulevard. Beer Nut, that's in downtown. There's Ogden Brew Supply, that's called. There's not one in Utah County. I have had some thoughts about it myself, but I don't know how to start a capital.
Maybe we should crowdsource baby.
I'm like, Happy Valley Brew Supply just sounds perfect.
Yes.
But Reddit, there's a whole homebrewing Reddit where you can post, like they have actually like a weekly thread where it's like ask dumb questions and people will answer them. Northernbrewer.com, they will actually sell you a kit for about $50 that will include a jug, an airlock, the bottle capper, the auto siphon, and the bottle filler, I think, for about $50. So all you have to provide is like a pot to do it. So, and they do it for about $50. So, I mean, Midwest Supplies does the same. And then there's also I know Salt City Brew Supply sells little 1 gallon kits too, but I don't know what they come with. Anything else?
Had lots of questions along the way, but couldn't remember.
Would you be willing to help a beginner try his first batch?
Oh, yeah, like when can you do like?
So I've actually thought about this and like
Workshop.
doing like a class and like a training and like everyone brings their stuff and we kind of like do it together, but I don't know a location for that. So.
The kitchen downstairs.
No,
Pretty sure that would reflect.
they wouldn't want that.
So yeah,
You get in trouble.
that's why I did not bring any completed.
It's a good call.
So
As liberal as this school is, I think we'd still get in trouble.
If somebody were a little bit daunted and say they've never done any kind of fermentation before, what would you recommend that they begin? Like this seems a little more involved than a very great beginner. Like maybe kombucha, they'd start with kombucha or yogurt or something like
so
that.
I never brewed any of that until I brewed beer.
Okay.
Kombucha is a little bit more involved, not too bad. Sauerkraut's a really simple one. So it's easy to be successful
But
with.
again, that's all lactic acid.
So yeah.
Those are non-alcoholic.
So those are all non-alcoholic fermentation. I mean, kombucha can give you a small trace amounts of alcohol. But
And it'll contaminate your kitchen too. You really have to, I mean, you'll have kombucha and everything if you're not careful with the fermentation. Because it floats.
right, all yeast. I mean, there's yeast in the air. That's how beer transfers everything. So wild yeast, and there is wild yeast. Yeah, there is wild yeast beers. People will actually do Brettanomyces is what they call those, and it's just wild strains of yeast, and they give it kind of a sweeter flavor. There's a beer you can actually get at the liquor store called Beard Beer. And it's a guy, he's the head brewer at Road Breweries, and they found yeast in his beer. They grew this yeast, and then made beer with it. It's kind of,
facial.
no, there's no actual facial hair, just the yeast from his
You
beer.
just strain it before you drink the yeast.
It's kind of a sweet, Belgian ale kind of taste, but. Yeah, any other questions? I'm kind of a beer nerd, so like ask me a question about beer, I'll tell you.
So I bought a gallon of the apple juice from Harmon's. And I already had some airlocks, but I bought some more from Amazon. And I think I got too complicated. I think I got a hygrometer and some bunch of stuff. And then, so it sat there for 6 months. And then I done it. I think I thought it was getting too complicated. But I think I bought champagne yeast.
So champagne yeast will be fine for cider.
A whole packet.
So in 1 gallon, I would not put a whole packet of it.
Talk about the airlock a little bit.
So an airlock, you fill this up with water.
Airlock.
Yes, so this will have water in it. and it will fill up, it has a little thing that says fill wine. Either fill out with sanitation liquid, vodka, or water, it doesn't really matter. People swear by vodka because if any of it gets back in to the beer, it's not gonna be contaminated. I've never had any problems with it, just using, I usually just use, when I sanitize, I fill the bucket up with liquid and then sanitizer, and then I'll just have a little bit left, and I'll just fill it up and stick it on there.
Sanitizer water.
The sanitizer liquid, it's not anything really to worry about, and then what happens is the carbon dioxide will come up, and then it'll hit the water, whatever liquid you fill this with, and then it'll bubble up underneath. So you don't have any oxygen going back in, or anything from the air going back in, or carbon dioxide just pushing the bad stuff out.
So it can escape, but it can go back.
Right.
Stops it from exploding, stops other yeasts from getting in,
Yep.
and oxygen from getting
And you
in.
just get those on
Just keeps your fungus out.
Yeah, you can get them at the brew store in Midville, you can get them on Amazon, Northern Brewer, Midwest Supplies, there's tons of online homebrewing places. So. I know Salt City Brew Supply also has winemaking kits and cider kits. They don't sell the juice there themselves, they should tell you where you can get it. But I think for wine is a juice kit, I'm not sure. I've never made it there. Cider and wine is real easy because it's literally just the sugars from the juice is what causes the alcohol. There's no mash, there's no boiling, nothing. You wouldn't want to boil your cider either because it packed in and it would start to cause it to jelly up a little bit. So.
What, if you were to do wine,
My wife wants me to do some wine.
This should probably be the last question, by the way.
Sorry.
so with the wine, then, could you just buy those? No, you wouldn't want to do that, right?
Probably not.
Sugar.
And even with apple juice you buy from the store, it has to make sure that there's no potassium sorbate because that's in there to kill any extra bacteria or yeasts. So you want that just as apple juice and ascorbic acid is okay, but you won't want any added sugar there.
Back before Welch's, there was no such thing as non-alcoholic grape juice. They invented a process to stop it from fermenting naturally.
Really?
Yeah, so, a few hundred years ago, not even a few hundred, what, 150 maybe?
Welch's invented grape juice in like 1912.
Yeah.
That was always alcohol.
Yeah.
Really? So much for Jesus not drinking wine.
Yep, it was real wine. It was definitely real wine,
And there's a
alcoholic.
reason, if you look at those old vessels for wine, the reason that it comes up and then it comes in as a small top is because the carbon dioxide from the yeast would create a layer so it wouldn't get oxygen on it. So it puts this little hole over the top. That's why we have those little clay containers.
Sediment rises. Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering how people did this before modern equipment.
I'm sure sometimes it didn't taste very good, but I'm sure they drank it still. So.
I made wine one time and I still drank it. It was horrible.
I heard a podcast by a woman named Susan Cheever, who's an author and a daughter of the novelist John Cheever, and she wrote a book about alcohol in America. And during the time of the Revolution and maybe the first few years of U.S. history, the amount of hard cider drunk by every man, woman, and child, and I want to emphasize child, on a daily basis was staggering. It was like 2 gallons a day because they did not trust the water and they were drinking hard cider. And kids would have hard cider before going off to school in the morning. They'd have hard cider on their breaks at the factories where their arms got caught in machinery and stuff. So it was, this country is a
Well, all civilizations.
Oh yeah, this it wasn't invented here. It's amazing.
The workers at the pyramid were given a gallon of beer a day. So the Great Pyramids of Egypt were built because of it. So there you go.
All right, well, we're out of time, so.
All right.